The climate crisis is progressing. What is the European Union doing about it? You can see it now. So on Monday, news broke that there's a new report from the World Meteorological Organization, a UN organization that looks at weather and climate. And they reported on, well, kind of bad news about how climate change is progressing and how the year 2020 was one of the hottest years on record. Let's look at the article. Reuters reports, UN warns of climate abyss as 2020 confirmed as one of 3 hottest years on record. 2020 was one of the 3 hottest years on record, marked by wildfires, droughts, floods and melting glaciers, United Nations report said on Monday, prompting the UN Secretary General to say the world stands on the verge of the abyss. Quite some drastic words here. And a double blow to millions hit by the extreme climate events, lockdown restrictions linked to the global coronavirus pandemic also delayed crucial assistance in some regions, said the report by the World Meteorological Organization. The State of the Global Climate report confirms its preliminary findings, including on land and ocean temperatures, and comes ahead of a US-led summit where Washington will seek to restore its credibility on climate change through fresh pledges. So this summit is on Thursday and Friday. We are on the verge of the abyss. We are seeing record levels in tropical storms, in the melting of ice sheets or glaciers, in relation to drought, heat waves and wildfires. And also the report showed the global average temperature in 2020 was about 1.2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial period, ranking it somewhere in the top 3 hottest years alongside 2016 and 2019, despite cooling La Nina conditions. So these are very important news, you'd think, because if we look at the climate crisis, we have to look at it in terms of how bad it gets and what we actually want to achieve, right? We have the Paris Climate Accord as a backdrop, as kind of the baseline that we should look at when we look at how much temperatures have already increased. And the Paris Climate Agreement basically said that all nations want to strive to limit the rise of global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees by 2100 compared to pre-industrial levels. So we have 79 years to go. We're already at 1.2 degrees. That's kind of alarming, kind of urgent, and kind of disturbing. So you would actually expect that people are widely talking about it, that it's the top news. And also, as the article mentioned, right, we are already in a pandemic and these crises go together, right? Millions of people are hit by this pandemic. And the climate crisis, which is just one part of a larger ecological crisis that is rooted in the way our economic system works, in the way that we extract resources and use energy, burn fossil fuels, destroy wildlife and nature. This system, this has led to the pandemic, of course, combined with a globalized world, global travel, etc. But this destruction leads to pandemics. There can be more pandemics in the future if we continue this destruction in our economic with this economic system. And also the climate crisis and a warming planet increase the likelihood of new viruses when the permafrost melts that can come out. And nobody knows how dangerous they are, how deadly they are, and how fast they could spread, right? So there's so many dangers still ahead of us because of the climate and environmental crisis. Now we have this report that says it's really, really urgent, and the Earth has already, the global temperatures have already risen to such a degree. So we need drastic measures. We have to act quickly. So you would expect that the media are reporting about it, that it's on all the front pages in the news. And actually, I looked at that. I looked at the 8 o'clock evening TV news in Germany, France, and Italy. And, well, how they reported about it. First, I'm going to show you a clip from the Tagesschau from Monday when these news broke. 8 o'clock, the flagship news, watched by millions of people. Let's see what they are saying and where it is in the program.
Die Corona-Pandemie hat zwar im vergangenen Jahr die Wirtschaft weltweit beeinträchtigt, der Klimawandel aber wurde nicht wesentlich verlangsamt. Das ist ein Ergebnis des Jahres.
So basically what they're saying here is that despite the pandemic, climate change hasn't slowed down, surprisingly. And you can see here that this is actually, they say it after 11 minutes. The Tagesschau is usually around 15 minutes. Here you can see it's 17 minutes. So it's not one of the first news items they're displaying, right? So of course they're talking about the pandemic, which is of course understandable. But if you really think about it, is this report and these news actually, well, you could say the most important news of the day, because they are so monumentous and they have so many implications for millions, even billions of people in the medium term. Well, now in the medium term and in the long term, you can only see them very, very late. I think it's also just a very short clip in these news. And I also actually looked at the news, the French 8 o'clock news at TF1 and France 2, the 8 o'clock news, and also the Italian main 8 o'clock news on the TG1, which are the main news in Italy. And they didn't even mention this report at all, right? And I think this is kind of symptomatic for the news reporting about this. I mean, of course, there's some TV channels and media outlets that do quite a good job in reporting on the climate crisis, but the fact that this report that is so drastic in its implications is not on the front pages and at the beginning of TV news is just it's just not understandable. It's actually really crazy if you think about it. So this is the backdrop. The EU has committed to fighting the climate crisis. The EU basically has a plan that's called the Green Deal. You should not confuse it with the idea of a Green New Deal that is very popular at the moment in the United States. The Green Deal by the European Commission is not that ambitious, not ambitious at all. It says basically that the European Union should reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Now, the world as a whole needs to reach net zero emissions by 2050 to even have a 50% chance of hitting the 1.5 degree, well, not surpassing the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit set out by the Paris Climate Agreement. So you can imagine that if this applies to the world as a whole, that Europe, as like one of the leading industrial powerhouses of the world, must reach net zero emissions way earlier. I mean, there are so many more problems with the Green Deal by the European Commission. I mean, all the plans so far by the European Commission don't really hold up. There's still a lot of funding for fossil fuels, especially gas. So there's really no way that the European Union is on track to contribute its part to reaching not exceeding the 1.5 degree limit. Of course, all countries have to work collectively, but if the European Union as an industrial powerhouse doesn't progress and doesn't lead on this front, of course, how can we expect from other countries that are not as developed as countries in the EU to also drastically reduce their emissions quickly? So the EU has been working on the EU climate law, which basically sets a legal obligation for the EU and therefore all its member states to reduce emissions. And so far, the plan by the European Union was to reduce CO2 emissions by 40% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. But because of the Green Deal and because of the renewed urgency of the climate crisis, they said they wanted to push the limit, push the reduction to a higher level. Now there were discussions on it in the European Parliament. So of course, for the legislative procedure, you need the European Parliament on the one hand and the member states on the other hand. And the European Parliament agreed upon reduction of 60% by 2030. Now, actually, that's also not enough. There were demands for 68%. 80% would be quite fair. I mean, of course, we should decarbonize way more quickly. By 2030, we should be carbon neutral. I mean, we should be carbon neutral now. We are not. We are going into this catastrophe, calamity, without even knowing what it will mean for us. So, of course, it's an urgent situation. But the member states and their governments, well, not all of them, but some of them, are really trying to slow down these reduction goals. So basically, there were negotiations between the member states and the European Parliament. European Parliament said 60%. Many member states wanted 55%. But 55% gross reduction, which would mean that so-called carbon sinks, so all kinds of ways in which you can we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. These carbon sinks would be added to the gross reduction, so that in the end, the actual reduction of what we emit less is not even as much as 55%. So I'll show you this article. Breakthrough as EU negotiators clinch deal on European climate law. This is from yesterday morning. So basically, on Tuesday evening they started to negotiate, and on Wednesday morning they came to an agreement. And the ones negotiating were representatives from the European Parliament and from the member states, because they need to reach a deal, because both institutions, the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union, they have to agree in order for the European law. The European Union negotiated a deal on the European climate law after 14 hours of talks on Wednesday, allowing the EU to go into this week's US-hosted climate summit with an agreement on the bloc's 2030 target. Finished around 5 a.m. Negotiators from the European Parliament and the member states reached the European law that will ensure the EU's commitment to reaching climate neutrality by 2050. So here's basically as expected, the 2030 target was the big the agreement to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. That objective will therefore also become a legal obligation for the EU and its member states. While the 55% target is lower than the 60% that Parliament had earlier voted for, EU member states made a concession to MEPs by agreeing to cap the contribution of carbon removals from land use, agriculture and forestry. In addition, the European Commission agreed to consider increasing the contribution of carbon sinks in order to bump up the EU's climate emission to 57%, although this is not written in the law. Bowing to Parliament's demands, EU negotiators also decided to establish an independent scientific advisory body, the European Scientific Advisory Board, to advise policymakers on the alignment of EU policies with the bloc's climate neutrality goal. Okay, so basically, I think I said it wrong. I messed up gross and net, but basically what it means is that the 55% in the end is not the total reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but only what is emitted less, net, right? So you calculate in carbon sinks, although that is kind of, a bit tricky to really account for. Now it says we raised the ambition of the 2030 net target to almost 57%. We got the greenhouse gas budget and the advisory board. We wanted more, but this is good. This is a good first step towards climate neutrality, said Jutta Güteland, the parliament's lead negotiator. She's a social democrat from Sweden, so basically the European Parliament appoints a lead negotiator that has to defend the parliament's position in the negotiations with the member states. Now in the European Parliament it's a bit tricky, right? So on the one hand we have several member states that don't want to reduce emissions as much because they are very heavily influenced by lobby groups from industry, the automobile industry, heavy industry, also energy lobby groups, fossil fuel lobby groups, etc. And in the European Parliament, you had a majority for the 60% reduction goal, which is also very interesting because actually there were also many right-wing neoliberals and conservatives that were against this goal. So you have the opposition in the parliament, and then you have the opposition from member states. And basically, the parliament got some of its demands, like the scientific advisory board, I think it was, and a greenhouse gas budget for 2040. So some things are in it. But in the end, there's a gross reduction of 52.8%. And if you compare it to 1990 levels, but if you really think about it, it's so ridiculously low, and the ambitions and like all the rhetoric that the European Commission used, and the rhetoric that we hear from leaders from national governments, but also kind of all other institutions. I mean, there's some exceptions, but all the rhetoric about, yes, we know the climate crisis is urgent, we have to act now, but then in the end they come up with this EU climate law, and this deal is really ridiculous. I mean, there was a lot of pressure on the negotiators because this was shortly before the climate summit in Washington began, where basically all the big industrial nations came together, invited by the Biden administration, to talk about their ambitions and goals in the lead up to the next COP in Scotland, where countries negotiate about CO2 reductions globally. But basically, this EU climate law that has been sealed now for now at least is really not really not a climate law. It is ridiculous, and it is basically it's a sign of moral bankruptcy for the European Union, and it's just so weak. It's outrageous. I mean, there were also MEPs that were really outraged by this deal, who wanted way more out of it. But it just shows how strong the fossil fuel lobby still is, and that we really need some other form of transformational change, right? We can't win the battle against the climate crisis in the frame of our current economic system. We need to expropriate large fossil fuel energy companies, and we have to radically take away their modes of making profit, because if we want to reach the goals set out in the Paris Climate Agreement, we have to cancel a lot of other agreements and contracts that are at the moment allowing fossil fuel companies, other companies in certain industries to emit so much CO2 that we will never reach these goals. And we have to do something about it. And the EU at the moment is really surrendering to the problem. So we really need a better solution for the problem itself.